Hello Year 9. In our last lesson, we started to look at our final part of conflict and tension. We were beginning to look at Hitler's foreign policy and the causes of World War II. So we did our decision-making exercise where we were looking at some of the key events that happened in the 1930s. What we're going to do today is we're going to go right back to the start of Hitler's foreign policy in 1933. And we're going to have a look at two things that he did to make Germany stronger in that early to mid 1930s. We're going to be having a look at rearmament and the gaining back of the Saar coalfields. So what we're going to do in today's lesson is we're going to work towards making a judgment about who was to blame for the failure of disarmament in the 1920s and 1930s. And we're going to also make a judgment about which was more significant and helpful to Hitler. Was it rearmament or was it gaining back the Saar coalfields? In order to get to that point, we need to be able to explain rearmament and explain what happened in the Saar and why those events were both important or significant. And the very basic starting point is we're going to have our detailed knowledge of rearmament and the Saar. So please make sure that you have recorded today's lesson title, which is at the top of the slide. Make sure you pause this if you need to get that written down now. So our first activity today is to have a look at German rearmament. What I would like you to do as I'm going through this is I'd like to jot down the main points. So you can do this either just as a table exactly as I've done it here on the screen, or you can do it in any way that makes sense to you. So first thing that you need to record is when Hitler began rearmament. Well, rearmament was done in two phases really. At the very beginning when Hitler first came to power in 1933, he actually secretly rearmed Germany. He didn't want the foreign powers to know about it in case they tried to stop him. After that, he openly, once he felt stronger and that he got a really good armed force, he then more openly did it, almost as a challenge to the other powers to say, are you going to try and stop me? So why did he do this? Reasons he rearmed. Well, think back to what we've already talked about. He wanted to destroy the Treaty of Versailles. Remember that the armed forces had been cut down, the army itself, to 100,000 men. Remember that they'd lost most of their navy, all of their air force. This was all about winning support. He wanted the German people to know that he had kept and delivered his promise. If he rearmed, he was beginning to destroy the Treaty of Versailles from the very, very start. It would also help him meet one of his other foreign policy aims of making Germany strong again. Make sure you've jotted down those key points. Another reason why Hitler rearmed is another one of his promises that he made to the German people was that he was going to deal with unemployment. The Great Depression had left around 6 million people unemployed in Germany. What rearming did was it actually created jobs. Because not only would you create jobs in the armed forces themselves, but you'd also create jobs in the industries surrounding it. Factories making weapons, making uniforms, making tanks, all sorts of stuff. And he handled the whole situation on rearmament really cleverly. What he did was he said, other countries haven't disarmed. So now we're in the 1930s, it's about time that Germany caught up. So he said it wasn't their fault Germany rearming, it was all about the security of Germany. Germany had to build up their armed forces because other countries hadn't dropped their armed forces. This made him look reasonable. This is one of the key things that he did throughout his 1930s foreign policy actions. So let's have a look at the details of what he did. We know why he did it. It was about winning support, destroying the treaty, making Germany strong, finding jobs for all of those unemployed, but also making himself look reasonable. So it all began with a disarmament conference. Now, the disarmament conference began before Hitler was leader of Germany in 1932. Hitler became leader in January of 1933. So there's a disarmament conference held amongst the great powers. This was the first step where Hitler began to show that Germany were being treated unreasonably. He promised not to rearm Germany if other nations disarmed. He said, I am quite happy to leave Germany with a small armed forces. He knew other countries would not agree to disarm because he knew that they weren't ready to do that. When other countries didn't disarm, he said, well, there's no point in us talking because Germany have been treated very badly, have been stripped of their armed forces. No one else is willing to do the same. So he left the conference and withdrew Germany from the League of Nations in 1933. If you remember from our last topic on the League of Nations, they'd only actually joined in 1926. What he then did in 1934 was he signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. Now, Poland, remember, had been a key target for Germany. Remember the Polish corridor? The Polish corridor was somewhere that Hitler had really had as a target. So they had bad relations in the past, fallen out over land. This agreement was never really going to stick for a long time, but what it did was it cleverly again gave him time and space to rearm. It was also an agreement made outside of the League of Nations, so it undermined the League of Nations too. In 1935, he continued to break the Treaty of Versailles by reintroducing conscription or forcing people to join the army. This was something that was completely banned by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935 as well, he staged a military rally. He showed off the German forces to a massive extent and showed the world that he was breaking the treaty, almost challenging them to do something about it. They did nothing. In 1935, Hitler was absolutely delighted to make a naval agreement with Britain. Remember, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany were only allowed 6 battleships. Now, under this Anglo-German naval agreement, Germany was allowed 35% of Britain's navy. Remember, Britain had the greatest navy in the world. This essentially meant that Britain were supporting German rearmament. They were encouraging Germany to break the Treaty of Versailles. This was incredible. Hitler continued and continued to rearm. In 1939, he had 950,000 soldiers, almost 10 times what he should. 8,250 planes. Remember, he should have none. 95 warships. Remember, he should have had 6. Make sure you've recorded some of those key points. So how did Britain react? Well, they believed the Treaty of Versailles was too unfair, and they actually liked the fact that Germany was strong, because they also didn't like Russia and communism. So they allowed it to happen, and they allowed it even more with that Anglo-German naval agreement. All that did was undermine Versailles and encourage rearmament going on in the background. So what I would like you to do, Year 9, is make sure you record over this next few minutes some of those key points in your exercise books. Pause this as you do that. So why was rearmament so significant? Why was this important to Hitler? So what I would like you to do under those notes that you've already made, Year 9, is I'd like you to write a brief answer to why would this be significant. I want you to consider the following things. So how would it help Hitler to achieve his aims? Now remember that a couple of his aims were to break the Treaty of Versailles. So consider how this is helping him do that. And it's also about making Germany strong and great again. Consider how it's helping him to do that as well. Also consider how this might have led to World War II. And for me, that's kind of pretty obvious, isn't it? Hitler wouldn't have been in a position to have gone into World War II had he not got the weapons, the armed forces, in order to help him do that. So just a couple of sentences about this, Year 9. So consider those aims. You've got those written inside your exercise book from last lesson. We also recapped them at the beginning of this lesson. So please make sure you've done that and thought about, well, this is significant, it helped him do this and this. Also consider how this is going to make him stronger and therefore maybe make him feel more confident and also have the weapons that he needed for World War II. So just a 2-minute answer on that in your books. Please pause this now and have a go at that. Our next activity is having a look at a 4-mark source question on Hitler's rearmament. So the question says, source A is critical of Germany's policy of rearmament. How do you know? So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to have a look at the particular cartoon, we're going to annotate it, and we're going to have a go at answering that question. I'm going to take you through it step by step. But the actual writing of the question is only going to take you 5 minutes. So what I want you to spend just a moment doing before you move on to the next slide is to think about, what does the picture show? What is the caption saying? So just have a look at that for a moment before we talk about it together. So as I was looking at this particular source, I picked out a number of things. So let's have a look at what I picked out as I was watching it. One of the things that I noticed was here on the particular picture, we've got the soldier, he's adding a P to the reparations. What this tells us is that Germany, they're no longer interested in paying reparations. They have lost, the will to do that. They are now preparing for war instead. Oh, that was a terrible circle, wasn't it? But there we go. They are preparing for war instead. They're not repairing, they're not paying back that money to France, to Belgium, to Britain, etc. Now they are getting ready for war. The fact that it is a soldier in uniform doing that is probably quite significant as well, because it's showing that they are rearming. They are getting more and more people in their armed forces. What we can also notice in the picture is that the Treaty of Versailles, look here, this was all about the Treaty of Versailles, it's falling apart, it's torn, it's tattered. What that's showing is that the Germans are no longer interested in the Treaty of Versailles. They see it as something of the past, something that is no longer important to them. And at the bottom, it says, for defence only. Germany, I never did like that old word, so like the look of that old word. So we don't like reparations as a word. Now we know that, don't we? Because we know, of course, that Germany always hated reparations. They always hated the fact that they were going to have to pay back that 6.6 billion over 66 years. Now, over the 1920s, those reparations were reduced, but that still doesn't mean that Germany really felt that they were in a position to pay them back, particularly with the Great Depression hitting at the very end of the 1920s. The Germans didn't like it. They didn't think it was fair. They didn't think they were being treated equally to other countries. So here are the key aspects of the cartoon that you would need to pick out. On the next slide, I'm going to talk you through how you'd actually go about answering the question. Okay, so how would we go about answering this question? Source A is critical of Germany's policy of rearmament. How do you know? Well, in order to answer the question, we need to do a few key things. The first thing that we do is we pick out a detail from the picture. It might be the P being added to reparations. It might be the tatty Treaty of Versailles. It might be the caption at the bottom and them not liking the old word reparations. Any of that would be a useful detail from the picture that you could use in that first part. Then you use a piece of knowledge to support that. So if you were talking about the P being added to reparations, you might talk about what the reparations were or what preparations you know that Germany were making. You might give some figures about what was happening in terms of Germany preparing for war. You might say what they'd achieved by the late 1930s in terms of the size of their army or their air force, for example. You might have talked about the measures in the Treaty of Versailles that Germany particularly disliked. So you're going to give a piece of knowledge, actual knowledge. You don't just say, I know they didn't like the Treaty of Versailles. You're really specific about that and you tell me something, a bit of knowledge about what they didn't like. If you're talking about reparations, you don't just say, didn't like it was a lot of money. Be specific. How much money? What did they lose? What preparations were being made? And be really, really specific and give that detail. You also have to link that how the cartoonist is critical. So you might say, I know that the cartoonist is critical because I can see. And I'm going to show you how to model that on the next slide. So you then repeat that and that's it. So in this 4-mark answer, you do these things twice. So you're ending up giving 2 details from the picture, 2 short pieces of knowledge, and 2 links back to the actual question. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. Okay, so here's some sentence starters that are going to help you answer this really, really well. So I would start my answer off by saying, I know that the cartoonist is critical of Germany, as in the picture I can see. I know, and you might say something about reparations, maybe to do with the captions or at the top there. I know that Germany hated reparations because, and you say something about the reparations, something very, very specific. I also know the cartoonist is critical because I can see, and you pick out a different detail. I know that the Germans were preparing for war because, and then you use the figures from earlier on in today's lesson. What this gives you is a really, really nice little starter for each section to make sure you're going to get everything right and get those 4 marks. Because what you've got is you've got your link here because you're showing that you've understood that the cartoonist is critical. You've given a piece of information from the actual cartoon, and then you've given a piece of knowledge, and you've repeated that. Link, something from the cartoon, knowledge. That means you're going to get your 4 marks. You have 5 minutes to answer this question. You've got plenty of time left for today's lesson. Please answer that question in your exercise book, take a picture and send it to your teacher in 5 minutes. We want these answers coming in before the end of the lesson because we've got more to do yet. And everything that you need to do a brilliant response is on this slide and a couple of slides leading up to this. Have a go, send it to us, please. This next activity is to have a look at, well, who was to blame for the failure of disarmament? Because disarmament had clearly failed because in the 1930s, Hitler built up and built up and built up his armed forces. So we need to look, well, who was responsible for that? So what we're working towards is a little activity where you're going to write a paragraph in your exercise book about who you think was to blame for the failure of disarmament using this information. I don't want you to copy the information out. I don't want you to write the table down. I want to use the information in it to answer the question of who was to blame. Well, there were reasons, definite reasons, why Germany was to blame for the failure of disarmament. And one of the reasons was he was the one, Hitler, who actually rearmed. Of course, Germany to blame because they were the ones that spent their 1930s building and building and building up. He was the one that withdrew Germany from the disarmament conference. Of course, that means that Germany were to blame for the failure of disarmament because they broke the rules and they rearmed. They were unwilling to engage with disarmament, so they were responsible for its failure. And also they were responsible because they did all this to start with behind everybody's back and they were secretly arming. That was a reason why disarmament failed. And another reason why disarmament failed is because they scared everybody with their military rally in 1935, showing off their successes. They encouraged other countries to start rebuilding their armed forces as well. So Germany were definitely to blame for the failure of the disarmament, but they weren't alone. Britain were also responsible for the failure of disarmament. They were one of the leaders of the League of Nations. They should have been leading by example. They did come up with ambitious disarmament plans alongside the League of Nations. It looked like they were committed. Apart from a lot of good words about what they were prepared to do, they actually did nothing about rearmament. They did nothing to stop Germany leaving the League. And they completely undermined the League when they signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Essentially, what Britain did was they encouraged Hitler. They gave him the green light. They said, if you want to rearm, that's absolutely fine. We're going to encourage you to do that. So despite the fact that they had ambitious plans, they actually did nothing themselves in terms of disarmament and actively encouraged by the mid-1930s Hitler to rebuild his navy. So Britain were also definitely to blame for the failure of disarmament. Finally, the League of Nations were also to blame because one of their plans, one of their main aims was disarmament. Remember, part of their their main aims when they set up, they wanted to stop war, they wanted to improve living and working conditions, they wanted to disarm, and they wanted to encourage cooperation and enforce the Treaty of Versailles. So they were behind disarmament in theory from the very beginning. The disarmament conference did manage to get people to agree not to bomb civilians. They did get at least one form of agreement. But they didn't agree ever on how this would be achieved. So they said, we completely, as part of the League of Nations, believe that the bombing of civilians is wrong. And we, the members of the League of Nations, ban that from happening. But they didn't ban the things that allowed that to happen. They didn't ban planes that could bomb civilians. So they allowed it to happen. The League didn't do pretty much anything to stop Germany leaving the League of Nations. So what should they do? Should they make all countries give up weapons or allow Germany to rearm? In fact, they did nothing. And what that did was it encouraged Germany and it allowed Germany to rearm over time. So your job, this is just a 4 or 5 minute job, year 9, is I would like you to use that to tell me who was to blame. Now you may say it was a combination, you may give a couple of examples from each, you may pick a country, but only a 4 or 5 minute task, year 9. You write absolutely everything. The next step in terms of Hitler's foreign policy was something called the Saar plebiscite. Now, by this point in the lesson, you may be running out of time. If you are running out of time, this is going to be your homework before the next lesson. It's really important that you get these notes down. All I would like you to do, please, year 9, is copy down what happened in the Saar. So essentially, the things that we need to know is that the Saar was an area that was incredibly rich in coal. It had been part of Germany, was made independent under the Treaty of Versailles for 15 years. For 15 years, all the coal was mined in that area, Germany's #1 coal mining area, would go to France. This was part of the reparations settlement. So it wasn't part of the land settlement. The land was never taken from Germany. It became an independent area. And that independent area, the coal was being fed to France. So in 1935, League of Nations, as promised, this was supposed to be a 15-year job, promised a vote, a plebiscite. And the people who lived in the Saar, who were German, remember, got to decide whether the region, whether the Saar should be returned to German rule. That was the vote, a single issue. Should the Saar return to Germany? You had to be a citizen of the Saar to take part in that vote. The vote was a real success for Hitler. And it was a real success for Hitler because over 90% of the people wanted to return to German rule. This was now a legal thing that allowed Germany to put part of the Treaty of Versailles behind them. They now had this really, really important coal mining area back in German hands. So the key points that I want you to jot down after the notes that hopefully you've already made from the last slide is these ones here. So this Saar plebiscite was important. This wasn't ever going to lead to war because Hitler wasn't breaking the rules. This was entirely legal. There was a vote held by the League of Nations and the Saar was returned to Germany. The people had voted to return, so he wasn't doing anything violent. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But it did boost his morale because the people had so overwhelmingly voted for him and encouraged him to say, oh, people must be happy with the way I'm ruling Germany and what I've been doing in terms of rearmament. So it encouraged him to break the terms of Versailles. Probably more importantly, what it did was it returned valuable resources to Germany. They now had coal. That was going to fire their factories. And their factories, remember, are starting to churn out weapons of war. Jot this down for me, please, Year 9. You now need to make sure that you're going back to the teacher in the Teams live lesson.